Hello, and thank you for joining today's webinar. I'm going to start with a little hold music while everybody logs in.
Well, we got a changing world, we need changing institutions. And we've all come together to scale up climate solutions. We're waiting on this webinar that has been arranged to learn how our behavior can be changed. We gotta change our minds if we're going to change hearts. But right now we're just waiting for this webinar to start.
Okay, thank you very much for joining us. Today's webinar is brought to you by Illume and BECC, the Behavior, Energy, and Climate Change Conference. Today's webinar is entitled Who Benefits? Moving Toward a Narrative of Equitable Access to the Environment We Seek to Preserve. Before we get started, I just wanted to introduce myself and my colleague Maxine. We will be your webinar hosts for today. So, my name is Ruben Sussman, and I direct the Behavior and Human Dimensions program at the American Council for an Energy Efficient Economy in Washington, D.C. And I also co-chair the BECC conference. And with me in the back end here is Maxine Chicumbo. She's an associate at ACEEE, and together we'll be sort of putting together the nuts and bolts of today's webinar. Before we get started, I did want to note that the webinar is, pardon me, I just wanted to note that today's webinar, the conference is, registration is open and the conference agenda is out now. Please head over to beccconference.org. The virtual conference will take place December 7th to 10th, and the early bird registration expires on October 14th. So I do urge you to check it out as soon as you can. Of course, today's webinar and the conference itself is being sponsored generously by these organizations. These organizations believe in the importance of behavior research in energy and climate solutions. I highly recommend you check them out if you're interested in the nexus of these topics. And of course, next month, we have another excellent webinar with Dr. Volkia Abrahamsi. She's in the Victoria University of Wellington in New Zealand. So that webinar will actually take place at 4 p.m. Eastern time on October 27th. You can head over right now and register for it and hear the author of this great new book, Encouraging Pro-Environmental Behavior, talking about her book and the various theories inside of it. Also, before we get started, I just had a few logistics. All attendees are currently in listen-only mode, but you will have time for questions after the discussion. Please send us your questions using the chat box at any time, and our moderator will get to them after our panelist discussion. Today's webinar is a little bit different than the webinars we usually have, as it's a discussion amongst two panelists. And so, because we don't have the typical presentations and slides, we won't be recording today's webinar, but please feel free to ask your questions throughout and we'll get to them at the end. And those that we don't get to, we'll send them on to our panelists to answer at their convenience. So, without further ado, let's get to today's webinar. As I mentioned, it's brought to you by Illume and BECC, the Behavior, Energy, and Climate Change Conference. It's titled Who Benefits? Moving Towards a Narrative of Equitable Access to the Environment We Seek to Preserve. Our moderator today will be Sherrard Robbins, a two-time TED Talk presenter, Comic-Con international panelist, published author, and international speaker. Robbins finds new and creative ways to utilize his platform in hopes of making his message about diversity, equity, and inclusion as digestible and palpable as possible for all. Sherrard Robbins serves as the founder and chief executive officer of Visceral Change. For close to a decade, Robbins has operated as a multicultural organizational development consultant, helping organizations and institutions across the country and abroad find new and creative ways to center their professional framework around diversity and inclusion. He has championed efforts to address and exact social change both nationally and internationally, and has been highly revered by corporations, councils, and institutions across the globe. Thank you, Sherrod, and I'll turn it over to you now to introduce the rest of our speakers. Please go ahead and turn on your webcam whenever you can.
Okay, thank you so much. Can you hear me, Ruben? Just to check.
Yes, I can. Thank you.
All right, lovely. Thank you so much for that wonderful introduction. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm Sherrod Robbins. I'm really looking forward to moderating this discussion with two wonderful panelists, really change agents and leaders in the field. So I wanted to introduce, without further ado, our panelists, Dr. Jalon White-Newsome. She is a senior program officer at the Kresh Foundation, responsible for the Environment Program's grant portfolio on climate resilient and equitable water systems, aka CREWS. Dr. White-Newsome is also a care team member of Kresh's Climate Change, Health and Equity Initiative, supporting grant making across the public health sector. Currently, she is an adjunct professor at the George Washington University in Washington, D.C., and as a researcher on climate, health, and equity, Jalon was a lead author for the Human Health chapter of the 4th National Climate Assessment. She provides leadership on various boards, including the National Academy of Sciences Board on Environmental Change in Society, the U.S. Climate Action Network, Health Environments Funders Network Steering Committee, and the Urban Water Founders Group. Dr. Len Nesifer is an assistant professor with joint appointments with the American Indian Studies Program and the Udall Center for Public Policy. In addition, he is the founder and CEO of Colorado-based outdoor apparel company, Natives Outdoors. Previously, he worked at the NASA Glenn Research Center in Cleveland, Ohio, on supersonic vehicle research, and most recently worked for the Department of Energy's Office of Indian Energy Policy and Programs, supporting tribes realize their energy futures through research and grant making. His research focuses at the intersection of indigenous people and natural resource management policy. This has included work from energy and water issues in the lower 48 and Alaska to outdoor recreation management policy. So as you can see, my friends, we have some esteemed panelists with us today. And so today's topic and discussion should be a benefit to everybody on the call. Just a few things to note as we begin. We have a total of 5 questions for our panelists. These questions have been designed for this particular topic, so we are hoping that we can center the ways in which social justice arrives in these particular discussions. Each panelist will have about 3 minutes to respond to the question. From there, we will move on to the next question in an effort to make sure we have time for our audience to chime in at the tail end. And we're hoping to have somewhere between 15 and 10 minutes for that, depending on the time that's available. So without further ado, would you say we jump right into it? So the first question for the both of you, is there value in reframing the conversation on environmental justice from harm to benefits? Why and why not? Dr. Len Nesifer, let's begin with you.
Sorry, could you restate that question?
Can do. Is there value in reframing the conversation on environmental justice from harm to benefits? Why or why not?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the things, at least with Native communities, well, I can speak from the angle of Native communities in this country. You know, I look at the creation of, I was just reading this book called Dispossessing the Wilderness this morning in preparations for the class I'm going to be teaching after this, but looking at the creation of the public land system in this country, when we look at national parks, national forests, you know, there's been a story of dispossession and harm and genocide and ethnic cleansing that goes along with it. But, you know, I think one of the things that I've seen is there's an increasing movement to how do we reckon with this history? How do we address this history? And I've seen that occur through things like land acknowledgements, through other meaningful acts. But I think one of the things that is missing from the conversation broadly is that, you know, we need to start looking at these opportunities for doing things like co-management and basically ensuring that tribes can have a continued seat at the table of these management of these national parks that historically have been our ancestral homelands. And I think we have seen that before. Are small areas where there are tribal co-management. The Columbia River, for example, with the Columbia River Intertribal Fish Commission, and the Bears Ears National Monument was on track to be basically a co-managed unit. And I think looking at how we manage landscapes for generations to come really needs to be centered on how do we basically use the thousands of years of knowledge of indigenous peoples to make sure that happens.
Yeah, thank you so much. And the importance of highlighting a group that has been traditionally ostracized in many of these discussions, and this is just one of them. Thank you so much. Dr. White Newsome, your take on question 1.
Sure. So first of all, I just want to start by acknowledging the world that we are living in now, and all of the folks that are responding to the multiple threats on life, whether they be natural disasters or racial injustice, and just give acknowledgement to those that we have lost, but also those that are continuing to fight in the trenches from whatever seat that you may sit in, whether it's in philanthropy or in your community. So you know, there's a lot resting on us right now. And so I think to your question in terms of reframing, I think it was environmental justice and whether it's a harm or a benefit frame. You know, I think there's always, you know, a benefit to reframing issues as to what it can do or how it can benefit me, my community, my organization, because sometimes that's the only way people will kind of receive the message, and then that can catalyze change. But as I think about environmental justice, I think there's also another side to that story. I think there is a harm if we do too much reframing, that we'll forget what the root cause of why the environmental justice movement started.
That's right.
And so I think if we don't acknowledge that root cause, if we only focus on the symptoms or the potential benefits, that's not good. You know, again, the environment, again, is something that has been hazardous to the health of many, continues to be hazardous to the health of many. You know, in many ways, you can't find a grocery store in some communities. You know, you step outside your door, you can't take a breath of fresh air. I mean, all these different pieces. So to me, framing is super important, but we must frame in a way that we don't forget.
Well said. Yeah. And I appreciate that perspective of it's important to reframe, or at least to consider reframing, but how can we do that without sort of sanitizing the actual critical components of the issues of which we want to discuss? That's a beautiful way of looking at it. We talked a little bit about harm and benefits, and so let's change the tone just a little bit, but stay with that, with a similar focus, and talk about the who now. So who, in your opinion, and Dr. Jalon White Newsome, we'll begin with you, who has historically benefited from an environmentalism? And then in the same breath, who has historically been harmed?
Yeah, so when I think about the word environmentalism, or at least when I started in this word 20 plus years ago, you would probably define it as the birds and the trees and polar bears, which it still is to a certain extent.
Sure.
And so when I think about historically who's benefited, it hasn't been people. Because when you talk about the environment, it is the place where people live, work, play, and pray. And so those that I think that have been harmed are, again, many of our indigenous communities, low-income communities, communities of color, you know, in so many different ways. And so I think until we begin to center people in whatever our new definition of environmentalism needs to be, that harm will continue to come on those people. And we see it today.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Thank you. Dr. Lynn.
Yeah, I think the discussion and framing about environmentalism, at least in this country, is largely predicated in looking at how we created this myth of wilderness and this idea of this separateness between man and people. You know, the origins of that go way back, you know, to the 19th century and Romantic scholars back then. But, you know, one of the things that now we're having to contend with is these larger cultural perceptions that, you know, we are separate from these places, and that, you know, the sort of environmental fights that we need to fight are in these faraway places, when we have environmental justice issues in our backyard that have very real consequences on people's well-being. I'm actually here in Albuquerque, and yesterday there was a fire of a recycling plant down in one of the poorest neighborhoods in Albuquerque, and they had a shelter-in-place order. And, you know, and thinking about, you know, that's a very real impact of, one, you know, the that recycling in many ways is an incomplete and often ineffective solution, and two, that we place these things in poor communities, and that's a result of policy. So I think looking at that larger issue of how we view wilderness environmentalism, its large part is like kind of we need to reframe this away from like these sort of pristine playgrounds where we can go and visit and sort of to escape the realities of the city, but in reality, like these urban areas are very much their own ecosystems as well.
And you both bring up fantastic points, which sort of leads to a question which we're not going to have time to tackle today, but sort of how really do we begin to shift that narrative and enter that mindset of approaching some of these issues with more of a progressive mind that creates space of growth and development in terms of how we appreciate the environment versus continuing to embark on the same behaviors that we may have become used to over time. We want to get a little bit critical here in terms of this discussion as it orients itself with race. And the question is, who gets to access the natural world, which we know is policed through structures of white privilege? And who benefits as a result of this particular dynamic? And we're going to start with you, Dr. Lynn-Esfer.
Ooh, how do we untangle this ball? I think in speaking about our federal public lands in the United States, much of the systems that created those places were often basically it began with indigenous removal, and then the creation of reservation systems had to coincide with the creation of national parks, because there had to be structures in place to keep Native people from returning to these other areas. And through the course of the 19th and 20th century, that included the erosion of things like tribal sovereignty and viewing tribes as sovereign nations. And in many instances, we still have legacies of that today, of tribes still have treaty rights that are not being recognized, that Native people in this country today have a very unique political and legal identity. And the other is, there's just a multitude. We're talking about 573 at a minimum tribes in this country that have their own unique relationships with the federal government, with the public lands, but in many instances, they, for decades, have been prevented from hunting in national parks, which is traditionally things that occurred in Yellowstone and Glacier and Yosemite. But there was these ways, these very systemic and ways in which policies were created to separate indigenous people and their cultures from the landscapes. In many ways, it was very successful. And so a lot of tribes today are basically trying to fight for, one, their cultural identity, which is tied to a landscape that for decades they were prevented from having any relationship to. And then two is just simply having visibility, because at the end of the day, Native people are less than 2% of this country's population. And so in many ways, we have to find allies and voices that can amplify ours, but in many ways they can be incomplete and like not really get us closer to where we want to go. So it's complex, but I can say at least in the last 30 years, things have improved quite a lot, at least in our relationship there. And that's not because of those rights were given. They're the ones we fought for.
That's right. That's right. And so much more to unpack there if we had more time, right? But thank you for sharing that particular piece. Dr. White-Newsome, your take.
Yeah, I mean, gosh, I just think about since March, my children and I have probably hit up every state park in Michigan. We have the privilege of having a car and being able to drive to a state park and actually pay the fee to get into a state park. And oh, by the way, we live in an area where it has a lot of free parks and green space that are safe. That's not a privilege and an access that everybody has. And so when I think about white privilege and privilege in general, I think about who doesn't have the opportunity to reap in the benefits of the natural space, which in this particular time, I don't know about you, but being in nature is one of those things that at least helps my mental health a little bit and getting out of the house. And so when we think about the fact that I think one of our grantee partners is Trust for Public Lands, and I want to say a recent report, and I might be quoting this wrong, but 1 in 3 Americans don't have access to green space. There's about 28 million children million children in the United States that don't have a park near them. So when we think about, again, low-income communities of color that don't have access to park space, to me, that is unacceptable in many ways. And so I think as we think about the benefits that come from having the privilege of green space and having access to nature, it is not only a cultural thing, but it's important to sustain the health of communities across this country. And health is, to me, again, one of the biggest threats one of the biggest threats along with climate change on our children and our country right now. So yeah, it is, the benefits are not equally shared at all when it comes to access to nature.
Thank you so much for that. And both of you touch on some critical points there. And one takeaway I grab is, when we talk about access, it's not just a discussion around one's right to, it's also a discussion around one's ability to. Physical distance, physical space. You both touch on, Dr. Len Nessifer, you touch on the systemic component that is sort of constructed to move folks away in order to then continue policing that distance. And Dr. White-Newsome, you sort of highlight and harken to this idea of having the ability to get somewhere allows you to, but a lot of folks of color are not in those positions to immediately access these spaces, and there doesn't seem to be much happening to provide some recourse there, right? And so then it's, as you mentioned, this idea of fighting for it is something we want to keep at the forefront, because history has shown a lot of times it's not going to be given to us when it's contextualized with white privilege. So then we start to think about movements and think about ways in which we can approach this from a socially just perspective. And so that's going to take me to question 4, which really is, and Dr. White-Newsome, you'll begin here. What principles of social justice can we use? And we're changing the tone here, so I should have started there. What principles of social justice can we use to improve our response specifically to climate change? So moving away from the environmental discussion we had and jumping to climate change, what principles of social justice can we use to improve our response there? Dr. White-Newsome?
Yeah, I mean, I guess I'll start out with acknowledging that part of the reason that we're in our situation now in terms of climate change being one of the biggest public health threats of the century is that our economy, the way we handle people, has been built on this notion of extraction. And so whether we're extracting people from places, extracting culture, extracting energy sources out of the ground, extracting life, that is kind of the precursor to the threats and the realities that we're seeing with climate change. And so when I think about what principles in general that we need to take another look at or remind ourselves of, I spent 6 or 7 years working for an environmental justice organization, and everything we did within that organization is focused on really the principles of environmental justice and the principles of climate justice. And so I encourage anyone who hasn't taken a look at those to Google them. There's 17 principles of environmental justice, and I tell you, those principles, I think, get at the heart of what we need to do as we think about addressing climate impacts. I'll just call out a couple of my favorites, but affirming the sacredness of Mother Earth, demanding public policy be based on mutual respect and justice for all people, demanding the right to participate as equal partners in every level of decision making. I mean, these are just some basic principles that should govern how we work with each other, how we, work and respect our land. And that is something that I always go back to as I think about my work now and going forward.
Beautifully said. Thank you so much. We lost your visual, Dr. White-Newsome. So I'm going to jump to Dr. Len Nessifer, and maybe you can work on that on your end for us, but we can still hear you. Thank you. Dr. Nessifer?
Yeah, one of the things that I've been working on specifically with Native communities is building up our internal capacity to do the things that we want to do. Part of that through Natives Outdoors has been facilitating both access to resources, access to opportunities to do things like become professional athletes in the outdoor industry, or professional ski and snow photographers and things of that sort. And that's been one of the doors that we've, I think, in sort of commanding in charting our own future, really depends on creating the internal resources for our communities to tap into. I just, there's so much untapped talent within our communities, both athletic and both creative, that, in many instances, their biggest hurdle is that they just don't have access to the people or the resources that could help actualize that. And then, of course, there's the challenges of intergenerational trauma and the experiences that go along with that, and going into spaces that don't recognize or don't know how to make space for those experiences. And part of that is in our work has been just to tell our own stories on our own terms in the ways that we see fit, and not sort of conforming it to often with Native communities, the sort of poverty porn angle of how our communities are portrayed. And so it's been really amazing to see a couple of our athletes, Connor Ryan, who's now a professional skier, and he and I have done lots of things, lots of big mountain adventures, and it's been kind of a dual-edged sword of, one, we're breaking stereotypes, we're breaking down this idea that Native folks are not capable of doing these things, both outside and inside our communities. So that's been one of the angles that we've taken in sort of addressing how do we change this future and this course that we're on.
Thank you so much. Excuse me. Thank you both for that, and a lot of critical ways that we can take some of these discussions. So I'm very excited to hear from the audience. We have one more question for you all, then we're going to open it up to the audience. So as we close out this particular Q&A portion from me to you as a moderator, I want to harken back on the white privilege component when we talked a little bit about space, and it reminds me of some of the work in my field where we talk about this thing called this theory called ontological expansiveness, which really speaks to the state of being and who has access to really the state of being. And this idea that Dr. Shannon Sullivan came up with that suggests that white people have access to race, space, and place. And without getting into too much detail, it actually sets the tone for this narrative that people of color are marginalized from the very beginning due to the lack of access that has been afforded to them based on their relationship to privilege within the social hierarchy. And so that being said, I want to close out with this last question from me to you before we open it up, which is, what must we consider when centering the lived experiences of BIPOC, that's Black, Indigenous, people of color, individuals and communities in response to climate change? So one more time, what must we consider when centering the lived experiences of Black, Indigenous, people of color in communities in our response to climate change? Dr. Lynn Nessifer, let's start this one with you.
I think when I hear the term BIPOC, I kind of cringe a little bit, because when we look at this country, there's hundreds and hundreds of Native tribes that have their own unique identities. And I think part of the challenge that we've faced as Native people is that in the sort of creation of race in this country has been the creation of this term Indigenous or Native. And the lived experiences that I have as a Navajo person versus, say, the Pueblo that live in this area is very different. And I think looking and walking into that space and working with Native communities is, one, the relationship of Native communities to the earth and to the environment can be radically different, and depending on where you're at. There's two tribes I can think of in Wyoming. One opposes coal mining and the other is all for it, and they're literally separated by a border. So I think walking in, understanding that tribes have different relationships to the environment that might not always reflect this idea of the ecological Indian or the noble savage, and that experience does not mean and does not negate their place in the world. The other is that Native people generally have a varying and wide experience with that culture, the cultural traditions. There's been a systemic push to separate us, and so some folks are not very well connected. There's others that might be. But the other is, in looking at climate change, for many Native peoples, our identities and our entire histories are tied to the well-being of landscapes. And so in addition to the sort of climate grief that we're feeling, we're also having this intense pressure around how do we preserve our languages and traditions in light of this very big existential threat. So it's kind of a dual dual angle of that stressors there. And I think the other is that it's really important to understand that, you know, as I would say generally white folks working with the Native community, is that you're shouldering all that history of that precedes you, whether it's, you know, fair or not. You know, many in Native communities will basically kind of look at you and say, well, you know, you carry and benefit from this history. And so a lot of the frustration can stem from that. So I think just kind of being aware of the broader history that we inherit, our place in it, can go a long way into sort of addressing some of these larger systemic issues.
Thank you so much. Dr. White Newsome.
Yes. Can you still hear me even though I'm not there visually?
We can still hear you. Yeah, thanks so much.
All right. I love the internet. No, I totally, I do maybe share a similar cringe when I hear BIPOC. Like that is like the new acronym of the century. I don't know. But I guess when I think to your question about, you know, what do we need to think about when we center the lived experience of these folks and communities in our response to climate change? You know, my thing is that communities have the answers. And where I have seen the need is that we need resources to help them make it happen. And so as my role as a researcher, as an advocate, you know, as a foundation person, you know, I think some of the things that I, again, try and keep top of mind is first humility. The second piece is creativity, and that just because I believe that it should be done one way is not always the way, or the fact that it's been done some way is not always the best way. I think how we value lived and learned experience needs to change and shift across all of the ways that we do work across sectors. And I'm a total nerd, and I appreciate the hard science and the models, but there will not be a fancy model that saves humanity. The notion of a model is to help us, you know, illuminate the risk and what we might expect to feel. But I firmly believe that the resilience of communities cannot be modeled. And our job as allies and supporters is to really provide the partnership, the resources, our institutional privilege to help these communities, you know, again, activate answers in their solutions. So that is what I think about, in some ways, what I've learned the hard way and what I've learned over time is that communities have the answer, and how can I be an ally, a help, an assistant to help implement whatever they see is going to solve the issues within their community.
Thanks so much. That's beautifully said. And you know, just sort of wrapping this particular piece up, and the idea of paying attention to the ways in which monoliths arrive, and is that actually a good way to describe a particular group, is a critical takeaway. And I think that's important, especially when we think about our own unique individual relationship to the environment and to the climate, and what we might be able to offer with respect to the agency we're provided based on, again, our relationship with the social hierarchy. So we're going to close out this particular moderated portion. I want to thank the committee for providing those questions, and I want to thank you all for approaching them so critically yet so foundationally in ways that are, as I like to say, digestible and palpable for everybody, I like to believe. Let's jump to a couple of questions we have here from the audience. Really quickly though, Dr. White Newsome, earlier you mentioned your sort of the 17 points. So there are some folks calling for you to share those resources. So if you wouldn't mind sort of sending that to the committee, and we can get that out on your behalf. I think that's going to be helpful. So we had time for a couple of questions. Let's go ahead and jump to the first one, and I'm just going to leave it in the air. And so either one of you can tackle this at your leisure. Can you speak about the relationship between capitalism, race and class, and access to environmental benefits? Can you speak about the relationship between capitalism, race and class, and access to environmental benefits?
I can tap into that one. I think there's a really wonderful book that I just read with one of my classes. It's called The Other Slavery, but it looks and documents Indian slavery in North America. It was pretty substantial. Just it arrived in a different form, but one of the things that really marked it differently was how the commodification of people happened that was quite differently, and part of the reason why it was difficult to track is that there wasn't shift manifests and documented sales, but these were things that were still there. I think one of the pieces that I always remember, I kind of take away from that is like the ways in which our time is commodified, and like this idea of taking self-care or taking time off is somehow not in good working form. And coming from an indigenous community, we don't really view and commodify ourselves in an hourly rate. But the way that this can play out in a few ways with access to the environment is that the legacies of slavery, the legacies of dispossession, those things play out in many ways that we can't. They're just numerous. And in many ways, the commodification of people is where that really started. So just quick highlight.
Great, thank you. Dr. White-Newsome?
Yeah, that's a lot packed in there. But I would just maybe add a couple of points that, again, coming from the philanthropic standpoint, and when you think about who has held wealth in this country and what is the distribution of wealth now, it is very disproportionate, right? And so as we think about capitalism and how that is really the foundation of our society, unfortunately, and what that has left or who that has left behind, race is, again, it undergirds all of it. And so as I think about this one book, Decolonizing Wealth by Edgar Villanova, and many other books, it's like, who has the wealth and how do we use it? And how do we use, again, that wealth to make sure that everybody has access to the benefits and really the human rights that they deserve? And, so I think the connection is clear. The only way I think that we're going to get to a place where, and I'm still hopeful despite, again, what's going on in our world, where everybody has access to the benefits they deserve, is if we disrupt capitalism. Like, there has to be a better way of functioning in this world. And I think this is kind of like we're on the crux of some big stuff here. So that even amidst all of the oh my gosh, I don't know, all of the stuff that's happening, this is an opportunity for big change. And I think we're going to see that coming down the line.
No question about it. Doubling off your point, there's an old adage in my world, which is, once you resolve race, everything else will fall in place. And sort of race is one of those discussions that, at least in my experience, if you allow people to pivot away from, they absolutely will. And so it's a matter of highlighting the ways in which sort of this discussion of this country is latticed within there in order to really understand, in many ways, the oppression that is sort of coursed throughout sort of this nation in its various ways. You sort of highlighted, Dr. White-Newsome, sort of the many things that are going on today. So this next question I'm going to ask you all from the audience is one that speaks to me, because as a practitioner of this work, it's one that I've been wrestling with a lot of my colleagues around the nation and around the world. We may be familiar with the executive order that Donald Trump recently signed that sort of banned any type of education that was quote unquote divisive or un-American, et cetera. Such as critical race work and work on white privilege. Tell the audience a little bit about what you see as the core implications of this order and how you would like to see attendees lead through this.
I guess I can start off because I had to take a deep breath when that came out. I was actually I have the opportunity to serve on a couple of federal committees that, of course, their boss is the president, our current president of the United States, and so they are obligated to follow suit to what comes down the pipe. But I guess what's really concerning is that a lot of these institutions that I would say in many ways have never put race as a priority are now starting to. But again, this is just one instrument to try and inhibit that motion, that that forwardness that has been needed for so long in these institutions that are 100+ years old. So I guess, yes, I see it as one barrier, because like you said, and I love that, like until we begin to bring race into the conversation and face race and talk about it, we're just going to be, again, just covering up stuff, putting duct tape on wounds. And so I think, for us, we need to be creative. So whatever the edicts or the barriers, I'll say, that are put in front of us, there are ways to creatively work around them and still understand that if our goal is to get to a society or have our institution work in a way where it really benefits everybody, regardless of your skin color, regardless of your income, regardless of where you live and where you came from, then we need to use the resources that we have in ourselves. So, for example, a particular institution might not be able to pay to hire a consultant, for example, to come in and do racial equity training 101. But what are other ways that you can begin to continue that education within your institution? You can bring in outside speakers. You can still have discussions. You can rely on community partners that have deep lived experience to come in and share. So I think we have to be creative when these barriers, and I'm sure this won't be the last one, and I guarantee come up, because like the time is now. We can't wait any longer. So when I was, again, it caused me a little bit of consternation when I heard that, but I was like, okay, bet it's time to get creative, and we're going to work around this because it's too important not to move right now.
Absolutely. Thank you for that. Dr. Len Nessifer, I'm actually going to change the tone in the position just a little bit for time purposes. I absolutely want to hear your take on this. But there's another question that's sitting here that I think is important to get out, just sort of based on what has been covered today and what hasn't. So I'm actually going to give you priority. We have about 4 to 5 minutes left. So I'm going to give you priority on this question if you'd be happy to take it. If not, I'm happy to have you answer this previous question. I just want to make sure I honor this particular one just from its tone.
Let's go for it.
Someone highlighted that there's been a little discussion around pollution and distribution, sort of centering this as an important topic to discuss today. One of the great obstacles to protect all communities from pollution is data, and particularly monitoring systems. And so the question is there a missed opportunity for advocating for those very pragmatic changes?
Sorry, could you say that again? I didn't follow that completely.
Yeah, absolutely. So the person is mentioning that we should be discussing a little bit more about pollution and distribution, stating that one of the great obstacles to protect all communities from pollution is data, and particularly monitoring systems. Is there a missed opportunity for advocating for those very pragmatic changes?
I mean, it depends on where it's occurring. I think, like in my home community on the Navajo Nation, we're still dealing with like 1,000 abandoned uranium mines from the Cold War. Where my grandparents live, we can't drink from the well because we're pretty certain that it has, uranium levels exceeding 500 times the allowed limit by the EPA. But we don't have the ability to test. Yeah, I mean, the entire community I come from, like that's something that we just kind of walk around every day thinking about. Like from a young age, I got to know what a Geiger counter was and what potassium pills were to make sure that your thyroid didn't get filled up with nuclear or radioactive materials. And I think like looking at that perspective, one of the things that is really critical is empowering tribal environmental protection agencies to do this. Community education is key. And I do believe that there is an important role for environmental NGOs, but like what I've seen, at least working on the Navajo Nation, is that in some instances they've kind of crossed red lines and done things that are slightly colonial in their approaches to protecting the environment. And in many cases, tribes are simply trying to ensure that their institutions are functioning and working well. And so when looking at who our partners, where do resources go, generally I try to opt for empowering tribal governments, local government, tribal governments as well. So like at our chapter level, you know, there's an immense opportunity for doing training for kids about, you know, not playing around in tailing piles, or, you know, educating them about how to be safe in their community with water sources. You know, there's a lot of funding that needs to be to fill that gap. And in prior administrations, there was a lot more funding. But, you know, I think at the end of the day, you know, my work right now is those solutions are there. We know what the solutions are to climate change, but really at the end of the day, it's a behavioral change and cultural change that we have to look at. And so, you know, I mean, I've basically refocused most of my work for this past year on getting the vote out and getting people voting on the res in Arizona, because that just feels like much more of that's, in my opinion, will help lead to these other changes that need to occur down the road.
Thank you so much for that, and thank you for following that pivot. I thought that was important to highlight. My friends, we're at time in terms of the Q&A portion and the moderation. I want to give a big thank you to Dr. Len Nesifer, Dr. Jalon White-Newsome.
Gerard, I didn't mean to
yes.
step in here. I just wanted to say
please.
that actually we have a little bit more time. If you want to address a few more questions, we
Great.
don't need to stop just yet. Yeah, we can stop at about 5:02 because I just need a couple minutes to close up. So please feel free to continue.
Okay,
Sorry.
well then, no worries. If that is okay with my panelists, I'm happy to continue. Is that fine with you all?
I have a hard stop at 11:55, so, but I can go until then. Okay,
sounds good. Dr. White-Newsome?
Yeah, and I just a quick thought about that last question, if that was okay.
Please.
But I'm good till 11:50. Well, 1:45 my time.
Okay.
Yeah, I'm good.
Okay, sounds good. So with that being said, Dr. Len Nesifer, do you want to tackle the question I left open for Dr. White-Newsome and vice versa? If so, I'm happy to say those, or we can move into a different direction.
I'm happy to continue moving forward. So.
Okay, Dr. White-Newsome.
Yeah. So just wanted to add in terms of the monitoring. The only thing that I would say is that the importance of, and I don't remember the total question, but in terms of either advocacy or the importance of data and monitoring,
That's
is
right.
that really the importance of holding our agencies, our local and state agencies accountable to having adequate monitoring that actually gets the data that is needed to make change and enforce policy. I spent the first 15 years of my life as a chemical engineer and really working in communities that were just overburdened, states like Texas, Baltimore, Maryland, things of that nature. And if you don't have the monitoring in place to really help describe the problem to the folks that can change the policies and actually enforce, then you're fighting a battle that's hard to win. And I've seen in different places where strategically monitors are placed in places that don't need to be monitored. If you get my gist, basically, we don't want to know what we don't know. So I think any advocacy, any research, any ways that you can begin to hold these institutions accountable that are supposed to protect you, that your tax dollars are supposed to be used to protect you and your family and your health and safety. That advocacy needs to continue to happen, and accountability is a huge part of that.
Well said. Yeah, absolutely. And advocacy and allyship are really going to be critical for any movement or really work that we want to move forward in any progressive way. Okay, we're going to jump to another question here. And this is for either one, whoever wants to chime in, please do so. How can we use design research to combat the false narrative of dominant culture? How can we use design research to combat the false narrative of dominant culture?
Like what kind of design research are we talking about? Like,
that's a good question. If I were to parse this out, I'd be thinking that the question is speaking to when we begin to think about systems and
design research. Yeah. Sorry, I'm like,
that's okay.
My engineering brain kind of didn't get that one. I think one of the things is just community participation at the beginning, and I think to Dr. Jalon White-Newsome, her perspective on letting the communities dictate the direction and the goals of the research is key. You know, and that just really means ceding control and like kind of letting the reins of the community to drive and dictate where things are going.
That's right.
And, you know, I think the work that I've done in Alaska with Native communities around traditional and customary hunting, you know, the state of Alaska doesn't give two damns about this, the Native folks' connection to the state or to the hunting practices or the policies that can help or data that can help drive that. And so the work that I've done there is just looking at, you know, where does the community want to go with that? And part of that's just looking at what is energy efficiency with the different transport technologies that they use to get around and hunt. And, you know, that was quite honestly like that in large part was just driven by their experience. And, you know, I'm just using my expert skills with Excel to help realize that. But, you know, that's kind of a way in which that can move forward, is just basically allowing communities to drive the ship.
Beautiful. Dr. White-Newsome, would you want to weigh in on this one?
No, I think that was covered. Yeah, no, nothing to add.
Okay, beautiful. For the respect of your time, we have 5 minutes, but I think it makes sense to pause here just so you can be a part of whatever closing remarks Ruben may have. But I want to just revisit again and say thank you so much for being a part of this particular panel. I know our guests really learned a lot from you. I know I learned a lot from you, not being sort of native to this field. So thanks so much for the opportunity. And I think if you have any other questions or any other resources that might be beneficial, please just send those off to the committee and we can distribute those as necessary. So I'm going to pass it back to Ruben.
Yeah, sure. Thank you so much. And thank you to our panelists. This really was an interesting and enlightening panel, and we're very lucky to have this esteemed group with us. I just wanted to close by saying that this is part of the BECC series of webinars, and that our next webinar is October 27th. Please go ahead and register at beccconference.org. As usual, this will be a free webinar, just like all of ours. And if this kind of research and discussion intrigues you, check out the BECC conference. This year, it's a lot cheaper than usual because we're going to be virtual, no travel costs, so that's convenient too. It might be a nice way to get your feet wet in this research if you don't know it, or to meet others that are doing this work if you are doing it. Thank you very much again, and we look forward to seeing you at our next webinar. Bye for now.